Hello and welcome to Women's Football Hub. I am your host for this episode. I am Carolyn Kent, and with me today is a consultant physiotherapist who's also worked as a strength and conditioning consultant for Cheshire Cricket Board. She has her own website, kidsback2sport.com, and she is, of course, the wonderful Angela Jackson.
Thank you very much indeed for the invite. Really excited to be chatting. When we met, I think we just found there were so many areas that we share a passion for. So I can't wait to explore some of those with you today.
I'm very excited because obviously, as you know, I worked with a lot of kind of age group female athletes coming through, and it was really nice to speak to somebody that you've primarily obviously specialised with paediatric injuries or children's childhood injuries. And I think we kind of found a kinship for what we're seeing with patterns developing and things that are changing now that we're seeing more active young girls. And let's kind of start there because obviously one of the big things that when you're working with kids is you have to deal with growth and maturation. So how does that kind of affect young female players?
Yes, I've been trying to control those controllables in youth sport for a really long time, but I've never come up with the solution as to how to stop growth. So I think we have to accept that is part and parcel of what we're dealing with. And it makes it a very dynamic environment. I think most parents will witness how their child just seems to change overnight. And so I think it's good to understand how growth is different to maturation and try and sort of tie down how boys and girls are different. So we would expect that most children will go through a big growth spurt, and that usually occurs in boys around the age of 13 and in girls usually around 2 years younger. So we're really expecting that big growth spurt in girls to kick in at about the age of 11. Now, what we also know is that kids don't all go through that at the same time. So if we're thinking about that standard 11-year-old, they're probably going to be in year 7 when they're going through that big growth spurt. What we'll also, though, see is that some kids could go through it as early as aged around 8 or 9, and some won't go through it until they're nearer to 14 or 15. And that means that if we've got children playing in a sort of year 7 football team at school or in a club, that there'll be as much as a 5 to 6 year age difference between some of those children skeletally, sort of psychologically, and that's a pretty unfair playing field. And I think what we need to therefore think about is if we've got somebody who's a little bit later to develop, one of these girls who still looks like a little girl, not a young lady, they're going to have to work harder. So you've got to be playing catch up the whole time. And that's going to potentially leave them a little bit more at risk of injury in those periods of times where they're working at 100% effort, just literally to keep up.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's always interesting, isn't it, when you see those growth spurts kick off? Because I obviously worked in youth male football at an academy, and then I worked with the girls through the age groups at the international level. And one of the things I used to notice was I'd see a ton of like Osgood-Slatters. Didn't see that so much in the girls. Is there differences between kind of males and females, young boys and young girls?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about where does growth start, what people are going to see at first is that in both boys and girls, the pattern is the same. So the foot grows first. So the kid looks like they've got flippers, completely disproportionate to their legs at this point. And they're growing out of shoes faster than you can buy them, costing every parent an absolute fortune. So with that, what you're going to see is that as that shin bone starts to grow, those calf muscles get put on more tension, the foot muscles are on more tension, and we get more traction at the point where the muscles attach to the little growth plates. So initially what you've mentioned there is severs, which is the condition at the growth plate where we're getting this pulling sensation of the calf muscles as they attach onto the heel bone. And we do get that in girls, but generally we find that it's more prevalent in boys. Once that growth starts to move up after a few months towards the shin bone and the knee, then we start to see these what we call traction apophysitis. You called it Osgood-Schlatters. That's where the quad's attached to the shin bone. And they've all got these silly names. I'm sure you kind of, nobody really knows what Severs is or Osgood's is, other than they were a doctor who fancied having a condition named after them. But what we're always talking about with these growth related injuries are where the muscles attached to this very immature soft growth tissue, you can get lots of irritation and inflammation. And these kids are sore. I don't think we can underestimate that. So what happens in the boys is that they get way more testosterone kicking into their muscles around this big growth spurt. And that means that muscles like their quads and their hamstrings pull a whole lot harder than it happens in girls. And that's why I don't think we see as many of these conditions. But what is interesting is that where that quads muscle attaches to the kneecap, so more at the top of the tendon, we see lots of another of these silly named ones called Sinding Larsen Johansson, which is an absolute mouthful. And so these girls get pain right underneath their kneecap. And the tendency is that these girls maybe have more hyperextending knees. They look like they've got banana legs. And so those kneecaps are really digging into all the soft tissues around that point where the kneecap tendon joins to the kneecap bone, and it causes a ton of irritation. So in my experience, the girls get it at the top of what we call the patella tendon, the kneecap tendon, and the boys get it at the bottom. So I think they do get it, but they get it in a different place, probably due to the shape and their postures.
And I think I always used to find as well is that when I was treating these issues, obviously they might, if I was working with the boys, we were in a structured kind of professional academy, so they had access to physiotherapy. Sometimes when I was working with the girls, here's an inequality. They didn't have access to anyone at all. So they'd been to see, say for example, their GP, and the advice they'd been given was rest. Now, a lot of the advice also says, do you know what you need to do with some of these conditions? You need to stretch your quads, and because that's what's causing this issue. Now, you and I met prior to this podcast, and I said, I have a real problem with that because actually I always found that makes it worse because you're pulling on the area that's uncomfortable. Is that something you have kind of found in your practice as well, or is that me just going off on a tangent?
No, not at all. I think what we've got to be very aware of is there's a lot of old-fashioned beliefs and viewpoints within the coaching world, within the physiotherapy world, and we've got to start to move with where science is. So if we think about these, and we're talking here about where in an adult, the muscle joins to a bone via the tendon. And so you've got this interface between the tendon and the bone. Now, in the child, as I say, that bony area, that growth tissue, still really soft and more vulnerable. So invariably, it comes off second best. So these are a group of conditions that we call apophysitis. The apophysis is the name of the growth plate. And so it's a growth plate issue. So if we start to talk about how to manage those, traditionally we talked about let's give them rest. If we rest that tissue, its capacity drops. So it's even less able to sustain what it was doing before. So the more that we rest kids with these muscle related, tendon related issues, then effectively the more likely is that they're going to be able to do less and less and less over time. So we do what we call activity modification. And that just really means find a level of activity that they can do with only a low grade of pain. And I have some pretty stringent rules on this. So parents, coaches, anyone who's listening, very welcome to go to the Kids Back to Sport site. I know Carolyn will put a link for you so that you can find this. But in the resources section, you'll see that there's lots of handouts. So you can start to read through these slowly, look at the different conditions and how we manage them. But importantly, there's my criteria on there. And it says that you can continue to play with pain that we know is coming from one of these apophysitis injuries, providing that it goes no greater than a mild pain. Now, kids are pretty rubbish at that because they just ignore it and they carry on playing and they don't feel it. But significantly, therefore, it can't change the way they move. So it's got to be mild in the eyes of the kid. And it's got to make sure that it doesn't make them limp. It doesn't make them kick differently. Any of those ways in which they could be lunging, trying to avoid a certain movement. So mild pain, it settles within an hour and is no worse the next day. So I think what we've got to make sure is that we find a level of activity. So they might not be able to sprint, but they might be able to do some short, small-sided games where there's not a lot of real sprinting goes on, but they're perfectly fine to keep the kicking to a short distance, the movement's not at full speed, and that should take the tension off those muscles. So that's my kind of like rule of thumb, is we modify them back to a point where in one of the Danish football clubs that I work with, they've worked it out by getting the kids to miss out on the high intensity exercise, but they still train, but they join in all the low intensity exercises, or they do a training drill and they miss the next one, and then they do the next one and then they miss the next one. So effectively what you're doing is trying to maybe reduce down some of the intensity of the exercise, not the volume. So can you take a bit of the speed and the kicks, make them shorter? In other sports, if it's upper limb, make sure they're not throwing over great distances or hitting serves from the baseline, stuff like that.
Yeah, and you bring up a really nice point there, because obviously training history and training load is super important. And, you know, I think I'm finding more and more that young girls are doing more and more and more training. And also, it's sometimes now either just the same sport, which has its own issues, or it's multi sport, which again can also cause its own issues. And then you add on top that they're usually doing PE at school. So it's great that girls are being more active. I'm absolutely loving that. But what's your advice when people are doing sort of kind of multimodal training? Do you kind of look at their week and go, right, you can do this but not that, and this but not this? How do you kind of break that down?
With regard to the apophysitis type things, the growth
Yes.
related injuries. So we try to get them to prioritize. So one of my first questions when I meet a kid is, tell me what you're missing out on most. Tell me what your favorite sport is. Because the kid might be in a football academy, but that's what they do. That's their most serious sport. It's probably the one they're best at, but they may actually like school netball more because that's what makes them fit in. So I think that the important part here is to talk to the kid and actually ask them, if we were going to prioritize your week, tell me what it is you want to do most. Because I think the risk is that we assume that the one they're best at is the one that matters most. And we've got to recognize when these kids do pick up injuries and we pull them out of activities, we're going to really isolate them very, very rapidly. And so I think it's important to manage what they want and give them a voice in that. I think also we've got to be very careful when we start pulling out kids who maybe exercise is the thing that keeps them in their mental health space in a good place. We have loads of kids who play sport with sort of autism and ADHD. And if we start taking them out of sport, and that's the only thing that keeps them on a level playing field and able to concentrate in the classroom, we've got to be careful. So I navigate this idea of reducing down sport very, very carefully, with the child feeling like it's all something that they can commit to. And mostly what I do is talk to them. I have a really fun like emoji chart, and at 10 out of 10, it's like the most effort that I ever put in. And the kid would feel like they've got jelly legs and they're going to puke. And then down at sort of 5 out of 10, they can still chat to their mates as they jog around the outside of the playing field. But they're getting a little bit warm and maybe a little bit out of breath. So we get them to start to understand what you and I both would call rate of perceived effort or rate of perceived exertion. But I do it with these emojis. And the reason I do that is when I let them play, let's imagine I say we can play in all of your activities, but at no point can you go above a 5 out of 10. So every time you feel like you're getting to a point where you couldn't carry on talking, you're getting out of breath, you're getting, really warm, I want you to sit out until you've got your breath back, and then you can go back in. So I can use this rate of effort to keep them doing the sports they do and keep them socially integrated and keep the tolerance of these muscles strong. But by not making them or allowing them to do their usual running like around the pitch like an absolute lunatic. So in my experience, the kids who get these growth related problems are generally kids that have one gear, and that's first gear. They go at life hard and fast. They
Mm-hmm.
love everything they do. They basically want to be better at it. It doesn't really occur to them that there should be another gear,
Mm-hmm.
because how else would they improve if they're not going hard? And then we've got the messages of the coaches: go hard or go home. Parents, try your best. So
Mm-hmm.
what is it that's causing this kid to feel like there is only one gear? Some, it's never occurred to them. Some, it's the beliefs of other people being enforced upon them. So I think we need to make sure that this kid really understands that it is permissible to go to training and train light.
So you bring up a really great point there, because it's something I've always said: communication. And young kind of newly qualified physiotherapists struggle with this as well, communicating with children, because it's not the same as talking to an adult. And correctly highlighted there, asking a child for a pain score. You probably do it once or twice and then recognize it ain't, the answer just is not coming back, right? And you learn that very quickly, and especially when you're on placement, it's always proper awkward when you're like, oh, it looks as if you've never spoken to a child in your life before. So what's your sort of top tips with regards to communicating with children, especially surrounding injury?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the topics that I speak most on at conferences and things, is that number one is we want them to be honest. So firstly, there'll be some children who don't want to share with you just how much it hurts. And that's because they fear that if they tell us it hurts, that we're going to stop them from playing. So I'm always quick to reassure them that the likelihood is that I'm not going to have to. Stop them from playing. But what I need to do is be able to prioritize and create an open dialogue to make sure that we get them better, and don't make this worse. So we kind of make sure that we're all on that honesty platform.
Mhm.
And then I use mild, moderate, or severe. Now, when you start to then the kid, let's say we've got a little 8 or 9-year-old and they've just jumped off my plinth, but they're telling me they've got heel pain. And they've just told me that the pain's an 8 out of 10. And at which point I'll kind of go, you know, tell me, did it make you cry? And they'll
Mhm.
say, well, yes, it did, because an 8 out of 10, I'd probably be crying by now. But I have just watched this kid tell me it's an 8 out of 10 pain and bounce off the floor. And so then he might say, well, yes, it did. Or she might say, it did make me cry. Well, why did it make you cry? Did
Mhm.
it make you cry because you were sad that your mummy made you come off the pitch, or the coach made you stop playing, or you knew you couldn't play in the cup final, or did it hurt so bad that it made you cry? Because these are very, very different in kids. So I think I'm like a really annoying toddler when I am doing a subjective examination, and I have a picture in my loads of my teaching around this, my daughter going, why, mummy, why? And that's me, really annoying. Why is this kid reporting pain that just doesn't fit with their behavior? And usually the mother's chirping in at this point, it can't be an 8, you played on Thursday, because they don't understand that it's the impact on the child that they are reporting, not pain. If you want to
Yeah.
know about pain, emojis are really good. So we use Wong Baker. And I supposedly by the age of 8, a child will be able to use what we call this visual scale, a visual analog scale, where you can ask a kid out of 10. But actually, if it's your first pain, it is a 10. It's the worst pain I've known. And you're going, but it's only severs, or it's only this. But in their terms, they've never broken a bone before or never done anything, too bad, thank goodness.
Mm.
So it's all relative. So I quite often go, tell me what impact it's having. Does it make you limp? Does it make you cry? And then fit it into my mild, I can carry on without thinking, moderate, it's on my mind, but I can still just about do it. A lot, I can't.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really, really nice point there, and it's something you've always got to look out for, is that emotional impact of pain.
Yeah.
And if they're being pulled out of a sport that they love and they're feeling uncomfortable about that, you might find that can either heighten pain, or that was the reason that they were crying, is because they were having to come off and they didn't want to. And I suppose and you're right, the word why is something that should be consistent throughout clinical reasoning, and that's what us physios will use in order to make a diagnosis. Now, obviously, we do get coaches and parents listening to this, and there will be coaches and parents who are working with children who are potentially, I don't know, kind of they have injuries or they're on the lookout for injuries. What signs should coaches and parents maybe look out for that indicate maybe a child might be injured or at risk of injury?
Should we do at risk first?
Yeah, let's do risk first. That sounds good to me.
So we know that injuries occur in or overuse injuries more, where we're not talking about somebody who's fallen over or twisted their ankles. So injuries that come on as a result of exceeding the capacity of the body at that time. So if we're talking about our growth related injuries, some of the bone stress injuries that we see, what we traditionally call stress fractures, they're generally caused by somebody doing too much too soon, or alternatively, they're what I call battery is drained. So we've exceeded our current capacity, either because our capacity has dropped, and I'll explore that in a second, or we've done too much too soon. So the most common pinch points for a spike in injuries occurs in the third week of September, third week of January, and the third week of the summer term. And that's because kids go back to sport and they do everything that you can possibly think of within those first few weeks. Trials are in the first few weeks for their school, their club, their county, and particularly those year 7, those vulnerable 11-year-old girls who are going to a new school. They'll be trying out new sports. Everything about it is going to be a risk for injury. The other thing that I think so underplayed is, think about that year 7 young lady who basically at this point might be a little bit overwhelmed. She might have to get up an hour earlier than she did for junior school. And so we're now lacking in sleep. Perhaps she doesn't like the food that she's getting offered at school. Perhaps she doesn't get to have breakfast because she's basically scrambling around in the morning trying to make sure she doesn't miss the bus. She's forgotten a snack. And now suddenly he's playing a ton of different sports that she's not trained for, never seen them before. It goes back to that word you used, training history. It's all very new. And new in the human body isn't a great recipe. We need time to get used to things. So I think what happens is we get this mismatch between a spike in activity. So parents, coaches can always be looking for those pinch points and try and plan ahead, because it's not too much that actually causes injury. It's too much too soon. So if we can plan for maybe like a half-term tournament and gradually build them up, build them up, build them up, then they'll cope really well with it. It's when it's all just too much too soon that we see it breaking down. So when we start to see those kids who are exceeding their capacity, the first thing I see is things like recurrent sore throats, lots of viruses. So we can see that maybe there's not enough energy in the tank left over for immunity. Perhaps they start to behave like grumpy teenagers. So loss of motivation, something they normally really love, they just don't seem to be bothered with. Perhaps they are a little bit more stressy, seem to be struggling to get off to sleep more. And for you and I, it would be feeling like we're in a bit of fight, fright, flight. We just feel a little bit stressed, and it's the body going, I'm not really coping here. And the body's pretty clever. What it does is diverts energy to where it needs it most, which is our hearts and our lungs and things like that. And it just doesn't leave enough left over for the other stuff. So we start to see these niggly injuries, grumpiness, stressy, sore throats. And then if that's ignored, then they may kick into an injury. But we also may start to see in girls particularly a irregularity in their periods. You may have heard of the term relative energy deficiency in sport. And we see this really at a much more mild level in our young adolescent teenagers. And really what's happening here is they're not getting enough for what they do. Maybe they have started to miss breakfast, and those periods start to get powered down a little bit, and we start to see that there's a longer distance between their periods, or even that they stop. And this can all escalate into injuries.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective as well, and we'll come on to the fact of the signs and symptoms that coaches need to be aware of with regards to injury, because that was the first part of the question. But when we talk about advice that young girls are given, we need to bust that myth that losing your period is never normal. And there have been people that have been told, oh, you play lots of sport, that's normal. It's never normal. the person might be pregnant or have gone through the menopause, but if we're dealing with young girls, we need to make sure that that's investigated. And it's something that I think we're needing to raise awareness of a lot more, and bust that myth that telling a girl that losing her period is normal. It absolutely isn't. So if you've got coaches and parents who are kind of potentially looking after kids, what signs of injury do they need to look out for?
Yeah, that was the second part of your question.
Mm.
So thanks for bringing me back on track. So usually what we start with, let's take just these apophysitis injuries, this growth related injuries where a tendon attaches into a bone. So if we start down at the Achilles tendon where the calf muscles join to the heel, because most people are familiar with that one, what you're basically going to get is pinpoint tenderness over the site where the tendon attaches to the bone. So if we're talking about one of these growth sites, then it has to be local pain. It's not going to be diffuse pain. In contrast to that, we may see that they're perhaps getting some lower shin pain, and that could be an indicator of a bone stress injury, and that's going to be tender along the bone. Now, the two injuries are very, very different. So where tendons attach to bones in the foot and in the knee, then I'm perfectly comfortable with most people trying to reduce down the amount of activity or the intensity of the activity as we've described, and see if it settles down. But the rule of thumb is if these are tenderness actually over the bone, we have to exclude a bone stress injury or even a stress fracture. So those are ones where we'd never let them play with pain. So if they've got tenderness down that shin bone, or there are other sites that we can talk about, but particularly down that shin bone, then we need to consider that those need to see a health professional before playing again. So firstly, we're going to have pinpoint tenderness at the site where the tendon attaches to the bone, and you may get some swelling over that area. Not all of them do, but some do, particularly tends to be around those kneecap tendon attachments. So we might see some extra sort of swelling, puffiness, and those are just an indicator that those tissues are getting inflamed and are a little bit angry. And that's an indicator for us that we need to do less or less intensity with that particular child. So if they're starting to limp, then we know that we need to actually be doing less with them. So the usual sort of signs and symptoms are soreness to the touch. They'll have soreness on activity, and it will settle with rest. So if it doesn't meet those criteria, we're not dealing with a growth-related injury. So pain on activity, settles with rest, pinpoint tenderness.
Yep. And I think that's a really nice framework for people who don't have anybody on the sidelines helping them to work with. Now, we don't only get parents, coaches, and players listening to this podcast, we also get healthcare professionals. Now, I tend to find young, newly qualified physios actually find kids, they want to work with them, but they actually find them really challenging. So what are some of the unique challenges that physios or sports medicine people might find working with young children?
Yeah, I think they are. I think the thing to highlight even to parents and coaches at this point is that at undergraduate level, so when physiotherapists and sports rehabilitators are doing their training, they're not taught about the children's skeleton. They don't know that there's these 5 to 6 year differences between children of the same age. And they don't know about these things called apophysitis. So consequently now, they're going to have that fear that they get, well, some of them have fear, some don't. If you don't know it exists, you don't know what you don't know, and you apply your adult diagnoses to children. So what we want to do is highlight that there are these key differences between adults and children, and reassure clinicians that many of the approaches that they know and are confident in with adults can be applied to children. So we apply a lot of these apophysitis management is actually very similar to tendinopathies that we see in adults. So it's not that you need a whole new skill set. You just need to have the awareness that the pathology is a little bit different, but you can apply a lot of the same techniques.
Yeah.
So
and
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, when we're looking at the sort of apophysitis management, it's something that I've been looking at with the students that I work with, and kind of saying, making sure they do understand where growth plates are, what apophysitis is. But I think even then in an undergraduate program, you don't get a lot of time to then force home that message.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you know as well as I do how little time you actually get to focus on topics in undergraduate. So you're very right about the experience level there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, this lack of awareness, if they then become aware of it, is actually the scariest part of that transition.
Mhm.
And so I think um, communication, I think, is just taking time to use some of the motivational interviewing techniques, give children a voice. So I got injured as a teenager, and I kind of felt like my parents made all the decisions. And I ended up transitioning out of sport and ended up at physiotherapy school before I quite knew what was going on. And I'm not sure I actually had any part in any of that decision making. And so I vowed as a physiotherapist to give children a voice. And so I said to you at the earlier on, we want to make sure that children feel like they're getting that time to articulate their choices. It's their body, so don't be afraid to ask them. And usually what I do in order, if I want to try and make sure that the child answers not mum, I will use the child's preferred name. So I always say to them at the beginning, I noticed that your name is Angela. Do you want to be called, you know, tell me what you want to be called. And so then I say, you know, Angie, can you tell me about this? Or mum, could you fill in this? And I direct the conversation by using the name of the person I want to answer the question at the start of the sentence. So I'm directing where that's going all of the time. So I think getting that child to have a voice, and then we need to give them a name for their pain in words that they can use and repeat. So one of the things that I'll do is if I'm describing sort of like a traction apophysitis, like a severs, then I'll give them the explanation and then say to them, now, I know you're going to have to tell every coach, parent, your mates why you can't play in the game on Saturday. How about you have a go now at repeating back to me what you think I've said? And then you've basically know that you've nailed that description to them and we're all on the same page. And then I do the same when I've given them the advice. Now, just tell me what you've understood by what I've said. So that reflective listening is a massively powerful tool, but it works in adults as well.
It sure does. It sure does. Um, there will be a lot of people having listened to you for the last little while going, I really think we should get in touch. If somebody was looking to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So my website that I've designed is called Kids Back to Sport, and it's a number2.com.
Mhm.
And basically what you'll see on there is a way to get hold of me at my email, info@kidsbacktosport.com. You will be able to download tons of free resources to be able to look up all of the stuff we've talked about, from how much energy a child needs, why do kids get injured, how do I manage return to play. So you're welcome to download any of those free resources. And then I do run courses both in person and online. And the details of that are on the practitioner page. But there's also stuff there for coaches. There's courses for coaches where we have slightly easier terminology around some of the pathologies, but nevertheless give you that vital information as well. So hopefully lots of educational resources, most of them free, so that people can upskill themselves on this.
Yeah, and we've also linked to them from our website as well because they are top notch. They're very, very good. Angie, thank you very much for coming on and chatting to us. I want to say to everybody that is listening, if you are working with young children, please remember that they are not small adults. Please also remember that if you are working with them, there is an evidence base that is for pediatrics and children. So please use it, and we will see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Women's Football Hub. The information within this podcast is for informational purposes only. No material on this podcast is intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please contact your doctor or another healthcare professional if you have any questions about anything raised in this podcast.